The night had a particular weight to it, the kind of heavy, suffocating darkness that only Chicago's old docks knew how to deliver. Rain fell in thick, relentless sheets, turning the cracked pavement into a mirror of the polluted sky above. The air tasted of rust, salt water, and something else Vincent Marino had learned to recognize long ago, the metallic tang of blood. Vincent stood motionless beneath the skeletal framework of an abandoned warehouse, watching the water cascade down the corrugated metal roof in streams that caught the intermittent glow of a dying streetlight. His dark coat was soaked through, clinging to his broad shoulders like a second skin. But he didn't move. He never moved until the work was done. The body lay 30 feet away, crumpled against a shipping container painted with decades of rust and graffiti. Even in the darkness, Vincent could see the badge, Chicago Police Department, gleaming faintly beneath the rhythmic flicker of the streetlight. The beam caught it once, then twice, like a dying heartbeat. Officer Michael Russo was still breathing. Vincent had not pulled the trigger himself. That was never his way. He delegated such tasks to the younger men, the hungry ones who still believed that violence solved problems instead of creating them. Marco had done this one, a smart kid with steady hands and the kind of morality that had been surgically removed at birth. The bullet had found its mark in Russo's abdomen, low and brutal, the kind of shot that guaranteed hours of suffering before the inevitable end. Vincent had ordered it this way, not because he was cruel, though many believed him to be, but because Michael Russo deserved to understand what was happening to him before the darkness came, because Michael Russo had once been his brother, not by blood, but by something deeper, by the kind of bond that only forms when two boys grow up in the same neighborhood, share the same hunger, and watch the same streets devour their futures one decision at a time. Vincent and Michael had been inseparable once. They had run together through the narrow alleys of the near West Side, where the smell of Italian cooking mixed with the stench of poverty and corruption. They had stolen together, fought together, dreamed together. But then, somewhere around their 16th year, the paths had diverged. Michael had seen his mother weeping one morning, not from sadness but from shame. A police officer had come to their building looking for information about a gang beating that had happened on the block. The officer had been respectful, but firm, and something in Michael's chest had shifted at that moment. He had decided, in that instant, that he would become the thing his neighborhood despised, a cop. Vincent, meanwhile, had watched his father disappear into a federal prison when Vincent was 12. He had watched his mother turn to cleaning other people's houses just to keep them fed, and he had decided, with the clarity that only rage can provide, that he would become the thing his neighborhood feared, a boss. For 23 years they had inhabited opposite sides of the same war. Michael had risen through the ranks of the Chicago Police Department, earning commendations for his work in organized crime. Vincent had built an empire that stretched from the docks to the suburbs, controlling everything from gambling operations to protection rackets. They had seen each other at crime scenes and court hearings. They had never spoken. It was understood that to acknowledge the other would be to acknowledge the choice they had each made. Until tonight. Vincent moved forward now, his footsteps silent despite the water pooling around his Italian leather shoes. Shoes that cost more than most Chicago residents made in a month. The streetlight flickered again, casting his shadow across Michael's body like a dark prophecy. The cop's eyes opened as Vincent crouched beside him. Even through the pain, through the shock and the blood loss, there was recognition. There was something worse than hate in Michael's gaze. There was sadness. The sadness of two people who had once been destined to live their lives differently. Michael's hand rose slowly, trembling, reaching for Vincent's arm. His fingers were slick with rain and blood, but his grip was still strong. Still the grip of the boy who had fought beside Vincent in 100 playground battles. Vincent allowed the contact. He owed Michael that much. And then Michael did something that Vincent had not anticipated. His lips moved. His voice, barely a whisper beneath the sound of the rain, spoke a single name. Just one word, forced out with the last reserve of oxygen his failing lungs could provide. Vincent, but not his own name. His full name. The name his mother had given him at birth. The name he had not heard spoken aloud in more than 2 decades. The name that only 3 people in Chicago knew was his real identity. The identity buried beneath layers of false documents and criminal enterprise. Vincent Demetrio Marino. But Michael hadn't whispered his own first name. He had whispered something else entirely. A name that made Vincent's blood freeze in his veins. A name that didn't belong to a killer on the streets or a cop working a case. A name that belonged to the one person Vincent trusted above all others, the name of his brother. Michael's hand fell away. His eyes went still and glassy, reflecting nothing but the intermittent light of the dying streetlight. The rain continued to fall on his face, washing away the blood in thin pink streams that ran toward the storm drains. By morning, he would be just another body found by the docks, another casualty of Chicago's endless war between order and chaos. But Vincent remained crouched beside him, his mind reeling from the implications of what had just been whispered into the rainy darkness. For the first time in his life, Vincent Marino felt the cold touch of genuine fear. The Marino compound occupied a sprawling estate 40 minutes north of Chicago, hidden behind wrought iron gates and thick stands of oak and maple trees that had been planted by the previous owner, a pharmaceutical executive who had made his fortune selling painkillers and then retired to Florida when the ethical questions became too loud to ignore. Vincent had purchased the property 5 years ago through a shell corporation, paying cash, leaving no paper trail. The main house was a monument to excess: 23 rooms, Italian marble floors, a wine cellar that descended 3 stories into the earth, and security systems that would have made a defense contractor jealous. But Vincent rarely spent time in the main house. Instead, he maintained a private study in the east wing, a room with no windows, a single door, and walls lined with expensive books that Vincent had never read but valued for their authenticity. It was in this room that Vincent sat now at 3 a.m. with a glass of 30-year-old scotch that he had also never acquired a taste for but drank anyway, because it was the kind of thing a man like him was supposed to enjoy. The rain continued outside, though Vincent couldn't see it. The absence of windows meant the sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a constant whisper that might have been soothing, if not for the thoughts running through Vincent's mind like rats in a sinking ship. Michael had whispered his brother's name: Tony. Antonio Marino was Vincent's younger brother by 4 years. They shared the same mother, a saint of a woman who had somehow managed to raise 2 sons in the hellscape of Chicago's west side, without either of them becoming completely monstrous, though Vincent sometimes wondered if she had succeeded in this regard. He suspected she had simply chosen not to look too closely at what her sons had become. Tony had followed Vincent into the business, as was tradition. The Marino family had deep roots in organized crime. Their grandfather had been a capo in the outfit back when Al Capone was still walking Chicago's streets. Their father had continued the tradition, which was how he had ended up in federal prison, and Vincent, inheriting the mantle, had brought Tony along when he turned 18. Tony was good at the work, better than good. He was the kind of man who could manage money with the precision of an accountant and make decisions about violence with the detachment of a surgeon. He had never questioned Vincent's authority, never suggested an alternative strategy, never shown signs of ambition to move into the top position himself. Which was exactly what made Michael's dying whisper so catastrophic. Because if Tony was the threat, if Tony had been the one feeding information to the police, if Tony had somehow orchestrated this meeting at the docks, if Tony had decided that Vincent had become too unpredictable, too old, too prone to sentiment, then everything Vincent had built in the past 2 decades was built on a foundation of sand. Vincent reached for his phone, then stopped. The phones could be monitored. Everything could be monitored now. He had learned that the hard way when the FBI had attempted to build a case against him 6 years ago. They had failed, but the lesson had remained. In the modern world, information was the most dangerous weapon of all. Instead, Vincent rose and walked to the locked cabinet in the corner of his study. Inside was a satellite phone, the kind that the cartels used, encrypted 7 ways from Sunday, impossible to trace through normal channels. He powered it on and waited for the connection to establish. He needed to understand what Michael had meant. He needed to know if his brother, his own blood, had betrayed him. And he needed to know it before the news of Michael's death spread through the Chicago Police Department, before the investigation began, before the walls truly started closing in. But as Vincent held the satellite phone in his hand, watching the encrypted signal light blink on and off, another thought occurred to him. A thought that was somehow worse than the possibility of Tony's betrayal. What if Tony didn't know what he was being used for? What if someone else, someone higher up in the organization, had compromised Tony without his knowledge? What if Tony was being manipulated, his actions directed by someone with access to information that Tony himself didn't possess? Vincent had built his empire on the principle that information was power, and that the concentration of power in the hands of one man, himself, was the only way to ensure loyalty. But in doing so, he had created blind spots, areas of his organization where people operated with limited oversight, areas where someone could hide. The thought made his scotch taste even worse than usual. Vincent needed to move carefully now. Every action he took could be monitored. Every person he contacted could be compromised. The usual channels of communication, the ones that had served him faithfully for 2 decades, were now potentially poisoned wells. He placed a call to Marco, the young man who had pulled the trigger at the docks. The number rang 4 times before Marco answered, his voice thick with sleep. Vincent said only 3 words. Trust no one. Wait. He ended the call before Marco could respond and powered off the satellite phone. He then walked to his desk and opened a drawer he rarely accessed, a drawer that contained a single document. It was Michael's personal file, compiled by Vincent's own intelligence apparatus years ago, when Michael had first made captain. Vincent read through the document, though he had memorized it long ago. Michael's home address, his bank account information, his known associates, his family history, including a detail that Vincent had noted but never acted upon. Michael had a daughter. She was 17. Her name was Anna, and she attended Whitney Young Magnet High School on the North Shore. Vincent had never considered using Michael's family as leverage. There were lines that even he tried not to cross, though he knew that most people would consider such a distinction meaningless. But now, reading through the file again with new eyes, he wondered if someone else in his organization had considered those lines worth crossing. He wondered if his daughter had been a target all along. The thought crystallized Vincent's resolve. He would move methodically. He would not panic. He would not rush to judgment. But he would uncover the truth, and he would do it before the next body hit the pavement. Outside his windowless study, the rain continued to fall on Chicago, washing away evidence and secrets with equal indifference. Chapter 3. The Mirror Cracks. 3 days passed in a state of controlled paranoia. Vincent did not sleep. Instead, he moved through his compound like a ghost haunting his own life, reviewing security footage from the warehouse district, reading financial reports with fresh suspicion, and most importantly, watching his brother. Tony had behaved normally in the aftermath of Michael's death. He had attended the morning meeting where the news was discussed with appropriate expressions of concern and confusion. He had made the standard moves, ordering the younger soldiers to stay alert, arranging for lookouts to monitor police activity, ensuring that alibis were prepared and witnesses appropriately discouraged from speaking. All of this was consistent with Tony's normal operational procedure. Nothing stood out as suspicious. Nothing suggested treachery. Yet Michael had whispered his name. Vincent had come to understand that there were 2 possible interpretations of Michael's final act. The first was the obvious one. Tony had betrayed Vincent to the police, and Michael had somehow learned of this betrayal and used his last breath to warn his old friend. But the second interpretation, the one that Vincent had begun to favor as he reviewed the security footage repeatedly and studied the financial records with obsessive attention, was far more disturbing. What if Michael had not been warning Vincent at all? What if Michael had been confessing? The more Vincent considered this possibility, the more it began to make sense. Michael had been a good cop. That much was undeniable. His record was clean. His reputation was solid. But good cops sometimes made mistakes. Sometimes they broke their own rules when the cost of maintaining them became too high. What if Michael had been compromised? What if someone in Vincent's organization had discovered something about Michael years ago, something that gave them leverage? What if that leverage had been used to slowly, methodically turn Michael into an asset? And what if, in his final moment, Michael had been trying to admit that he had failed, that he had been the betrayer but not of his own volition? That he was trying to warn Vincent that there was someone deeper in the operation who had orchestrated everything, someone who had access to Michael just as they had access to Vincent's own inner circle. With this framework in place, Vincent began to review the financial records differently. He looked for anomalies, for money that moved in patterns that didn't quite make sense, for expenditures that were slightly too high, for gaps in the records where there should have been documentation, and he found them. In the gambling operations that were managed by a lieutenant named Salvatore Rossi, a man Vincent had known for 15 years, a man he had considered a friend, there were discrepancies, thousands of dollars moving through accounts that didn't quite line up with the recorded revenue from the casinos. It was subtle, It was the kind of thing that would only be noticed by someone looking with the kind of intense scrutiny that Vincent was now applying. But it was there. Vincent pulled the security footage from the gambling operations for the past 6 months and watched, fast-forwarding through hours of footage until he found what he was looking for. A meeting between Salvatore and a man Vincent didn't recognize. The man wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from institutional power. There was only one reason such a man would meet with one of Vincent's lieutenants in the back office of a casino at 2 in the morning. The man was FBI. Vincent sat back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together with the finality of a lock closing. Michael hadn't been the mastermind. Michael had been the tool, and the architect of the entire operation had been Salvatore Rossi, a man who had been working for the FBI for at least 6 months and possibly much longer. But how had Salvatore gained access to Michael? How had he known to leverage the old friendship? Unless Michael hadn't been leveraged at all. Unless Michael had come to Salvatore with information about Vincent. Unless the two of them had been working together all along. It was a betrayal so complete, so comprehensive in its scope, that Vincent's mind almost refused to process it. 2 men he had known for decades. 2 men who had broken bread at his table. 2 men who had apparently been systematically working to bring down his empire. Vincent should have felt rage. Instead, he felt something closer to exhaustion. He was about to move against Salvatore when his private phone rang. Not the satellite phone. His personal phone, the one that only family used. It was Tony's voice on the other end, and his brother sounded frightened. "Vincent, you need to come to the house right now. It's not safe to talk on the phone, not safe at all." Vincent's hand froze on the receiver. This was it. This was the moment where everything would be decided. "I'm coming," he said, and ended the call. The drive from the compound to Tony's house in Naperville took 50 minutes. Vincent drove himself, a habit he had developed in recent years. He found that moving the car with his own hands, making his own decisions about speed and direction, helped him think clearly. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the road slick and reflecting the streetlights in distorted patterns. Tony's house was a modest 2-story colonial on a quiet street lined with similar properties. It was the kind of neighborhood where neighbors didn't ask questions and families kept to themselves. Perfect for a man engaged in organized crime who wanted to maintain the pretense of normalcy. Vincent pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, his hands still on the steering wheel. Through the front window he could see Tony moving inside, pacing back and forth with the kind of agitated energy that suggested panic. Vincent got out of the car and walked to the front door. He knocked once. Tony opened it immediately, as if he had been waiting directly behind the door, watching for his brother's arrival. "Inside." "Quickly," Tony said, pulling Vincent through the threshold and closing the door behind him. The interior of the house was neat and sparse. Tony had never married, had no children that Vincent was aware of, and seemed to spend most of his time either working or sleeping. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, the kind of furnishings that could have belonged to anyone. "What's happened?" Vincent asked, keeping his voice neutral. Tony ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Vincent recognized from their childhood. It was what Tony did when he was afraid. "I need to tell you something, and you need to listen without interrupting." "Can you do that?" "I can," Vincent said. 3 months ago, Salvatore came to me with a proposal. He said he had been approached by someone on the inside of the federal government, someone who wanted to help bring down the entire organization. This person had access to surveillance equipment, to financial records, to everything they needed to build an irrefutable case. Salvatore said this person had promised that if I cooperated, if I agreed to help gather evidence against you, then I would be protected, that I would be given immunity in exchange for my testimony. Vincent felt something cold move through his chest. "And you agreed," he said. "It was not a question." "I agreed," Tony confirmed. "But not for the reasons you might think. Not because I wanted power. Not because I wanted your position. I did it because I've been tired, Vincent. Tired for years. Tired of this life. Tired of the violence. Tired of the moral compromise. And because," he paused, his voice becoming quieter, "because I wanted out and I couldn't see any other way to achieve it." "You betrayed me," Vincent said flatly. "I did," Tony acknowledged. "But I need you to understand that I was about to call it off. That's why I called you. That's why I asked you to come here. Because something happened 3 days ago that changed everything." "Michael Russo," Vincent said. "Yes, Michael Russo." Salvatore told me that Michael was going to be eliminated because he had found out about the investigation, because he had realized that I was compromised and he was going to warn you. Salvatore said that the only way to protect us all was to remove Michael before he could tell you anything. And you allowed it, Vincent said. I didn't have a choice. Once you're inside the system, once the federal government has decided to use you, you don't get to make choices anymore. They make the choices for you. They tell you what you're going to do and you do it because the alternative is being discredited, destroyed, imprisoned. Michael was my friend too, Vincent. My friend long before he was the problem. Tony's voice had risen and his hands were shaking. He looked like a man standing on the edge of an abyss, looking down into the darkness. But that's not all, Tony continued. 2 days ago, Salvatore told me that the plan had changed. He said the FBI had decided that simply gathering evidence wasn't enough. They wanted to do what they called a complete dismantling of the organization, which means they want you arrested. They want me to testify against you, and they want every other significant player in the organization to be taken down as well. Hundreds of people, Vincent. Hundreds of people I've worked with, grown up with, and they all go to prison because I couldn't find the strength to say no. Tony collapsed onto the nearest chair, his body folding in on itself as if the weight of his confession had finally become too much to bear. So I decided to do something I never thought I would do, Tony said. I decided to contact Salvatore and tell him that I wanted to go to the police directly, that I wanted to cut a deal with someone other than the FBI, that I wanted to protect you, or at least protect our people, because I realized that I had made a terrible mistake, and the only way to have any hope of redemption was to own that mistake and try to fix it. Vincent stared at his brother, processing what he had just heard. The betrayal was deeper and more twisted than he had imagined, but it was also different from what he had feared. Where's Salvatore now? Vincent asked. That's the thing, Tony said. That's why I'm terrified. I couldn't reach him. I've been trying for the past 2 days and he's gone, disappeared. No one's seen him since yesterday morning. And I think that means the FBI has figured out that I'm planning to turn. I think it means they're going to move fast. I think it means that you need to disappear right now before they come for you. Vincent looked at his brother, really looked at him for the first time in years. He saw the man that Tony had become. Someone caught between two terrible options. Someone who had tried to engineer his own escape from a life that had become unbearable. Someone who had been used and manipulated by forces far more powerful than he understood. And Vincent realized something that shocked him in its clarity. He didn't feel rage toward his brother, he felt pity. The safe house was located in the basement of an abandoned printing facility on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood so economically devastated that the police barely bothered to patrol anymore. Vincent had maintained the location for precisely this kind of contingency, a place where he could wait out a crisis without worrying about police surveillance or rival organizations tracking his movements. He had brought Tony with him, though he was uncertain whether this was an act of mercy or one final mistake. The basement was divided into 2 sections, a fortified living area with enough supplies for 3 months and a separate room that contained equipment for secure communication. Vincent had spent the first 6 hours after arriving at the safe house on the encrypted satellite phone, making arrangements. He called in favors from people he had helped over the years, judges, politicians, even a few federal agents who had been on his payroll long enough to have developed a vested interest in his continued survival. He was reaching out to the network of protection that wealth and influence could purchase, trying to buy time before the official machinery of law enforcement caught up with him. But even as he worked the phones, even as he made contingency plans for flying to countries with no extradition treaties, even as he arranged for his assets to be liquidated and moved to offshore accounts, Vincent knew that he was engaged in a futile, delaying action. The world had changed. The era of the independent crime boss operating with impunity was ending. The federal government had become too sophisticated, too determined, and most importantly, too patient. Salvatore Rossi had probably been working as an informant for years before Vincent ever knew about it, which meant there was likely a deep web of surveillance and documentation that had already been assembled, which meant that even if Vincent managed to evade capture for the next few weeks, the case would already be built. Michael had whispered Tony's name because Tony was the key. Tony's testimony, combined with Salvatore's evidence, would be enough to convict Vincent on multiple counts. And Vincent's conviction would likely trigger a cascade of arrests throughout the organization, as junior members sought to make deals in exchange for reduced sentences. In the end, the empire Vincent had spent 2 decades building would crumble not because of superior force or tactical brilliance, but because of a single moment of weakness, a moment when Vincent had trusted his younger brother, and that trust had become a liability. It was on the third day in the safe house when the walls finally gave way. Vincent was reviewing financial documents, trying to trace exactly how much money Salvatore had siphoned off, when the power went out. All of it. The backup generators, the encrypted phone system, the security cameras, everything. He moved instinctively to the weapons cache, his muscle memory operating even though his mind had not yet fully accepted what was happening. But there was no need. A moment later, the basement door was breached by federal agents, their weapons drawn, their body armor bearing the letters FBI in reflective yellow. Vincent counted 6 of them, which suggested that they expected serious resistance. They had no way of knowing that Vincent Marino, the most feared Mafia boss in the Midwest, was not going to resist. He raised his hands and allowed himself to be taken into custody. It was a surreal moment, one that Vincent had imagined many times but never truly believed would arrive. The reality of it was disappointing in its mundanity. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final stand, just the clinical efficiency of federal law enforcement doing their job. As he was being led up the stairs, Vincent saw Tony in the back of the basement room, sitting against the wall with his hands on his head. Their eyes met for just a moment. In that moment, Vincent understood everything. Tony had called the FBI. The moment Vincent had arrived at the safe house, the moment Vincent had powered up the encrypted communication system and begun making calls, Tony had used a device hidden in his clothing to signal his location to the federal agents who had been monitoring him all along. Tony had used his own brother to save himself. It was, Vincent had to admit, a solution of brutal efficiency. By leading the FBI to Vincent, Tony had proven his cooperation and usefulness. He had effectively guaranteed his own deal, immunity, in exchange for facilitating his brother's arrest. In the parking lot above the basement, Vincent was transferred to an unmarked vehicle. As they drove through the streets of Chicago, he watched the city pass by, the neighborhoods where he had grown up, the streets where he had built his empire, the places where he had learned to be both a predator and a man. He thought about Michael Russo, lying on the rain-slicked pavement of the docks with a bullet in his abdomen. He thought about what Michael had been trying to tell him in those final moments. Not that Tony was a traitor, but that Tony was the one who needed to be warned. That Tony was the one who was going to betray him. That the name whispered in the rain was not the name of an enemy, but the name of family. Michael had known. Somehow, in his final moment, Michael had understood what was about to happen. Perhaps he had been trying to give Vincent a chance to escape. Perhaps he had been trying to give Vincent a way to protect himself before the walls came crashing down. But Vincent hadn't understood. Vincent had spent 3 days looking for an enemy in his organization when the real threat had been sitting at his dinner table all along. At the federal building, Vincent was processed with the efficiency that the system had perfected over decades. His clothes were taken, replaced with the gray institutional wear that the Bureau provided. His personal effects, his watch, his rings, his wallet, were cataloged and stored. His fingerprints were taken, his photograph was recorded. It was during this process that one of the younger agents mentioned, almost casually, that they had found evidence of Salvatore Rossi disposing of what appeared to be surveillance equipment in the Chicago River. No body had been found yet, but they were confident they would locate it eventually. Apparently, Salvatore had decided that discretion required his own disappearance, and he had taken steps to ensure his permanent removal from the picture. Vincent was placed in a holding cell to await his arraignment. The cell was small and gray and smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. He sat on the narrow cot and waited for the machinery of justice to proceed at its own pace. That night, unable to sleep, Vincent thought about the question he had been avoiding since the moment he heard Michael's final whisper. What had Michael truly meant? The detective who had taken his statement after Michael's body was recovered had mentioned something odd. Michael's hand had been clenched when they found him. Inside his fist was a piece of torn paper with writing on it. The writing was Michael's, confirmed by handwriting analysis. And the writing consisted of a single name, Tony. But that's not all. Next to the name was an address. Not Tony's address in Naperville. An entirely different address, one in a neighborhood on the North Shore. An address that, after further investigation, turned out to be the location of a small house rented under a false name. A house that contained a sophisticated surveillance operation, complete with recording equipment, financial records, and hundreds of photographs of Vincent Marino in various states of criminal activity. In other words, the house that Salvatore Rossi had been using as his base of operations. Michael hadn't been trying to warn Vincent about Tony's betrayal. Michael had been trying to tell Vincent who was behind Tony's recruitment. Michael had been trying to give Vincent the information he would need to understand what was about to happen. But Michael's death had occurred before he could fully communicate this information. And Vincent, in his panic and confusion, had misinterpreted the message entirely, which meant that Michael, in his dying moment, with his last conscious act, had tried to help Vincent understand his own situation, had tried to give his old friend a final gift, the truth, and Vincent had wasted it. In the darkness of his cell, Vincent Marino, crime boss, ruthless businessman, man who had built an empire through violence and manipulation, felt something that he had not experienced in many years. He felt regret, not for the lives he had destroyed, though that was certainly deserving of regret, not for the crimes he had committed, though those would eventually be catalogued and used against him in court, but regret for the friendship he had abandoned so many years ago when the paths diverged, regret for the man he had not become, regret for the choice he had made that night, all those decades ago when he decided that fear and power were more valuable than principle and honor, and regret for not understanding in time what Michael had been trying to tell him at the end. The name whispered in the rain had been a warning about a threat that Vincent had never fully comprehended, until it was too late. The name had been meant to save him, and instead, it had sealed his fate. Because Tony had been monitoring Vincent's movements, and Tony had known exactly where Vincent would go when the walls started closing in. By the time dawn came to the federal holding facility, Vincent Marino's empire was no longer an empire. It was rubble. The younger members of his organization were being arrested in coordinated raids across the Midwest. The financial accounts had been frozen. The properties had been seized. The machinery that had taken 2 decades to build was being dismantled in a single day. All because of a single moment at the docks in Chicago. A single moment when a dying man had whispered a name into the rain, and a Mafia boss had finally understood that the true threat to his empire had never been external. It had always been within. 6 months later, in a federal courthouse in Chicago, Vincent Marino was sentenced to 25 years in prison for racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. Tony Marino, in exchange for his cooperation and testimony, received immunity and entered witness protection with a new identity and a modest stipend provided by the federal government. Salvatore Rossi's body was never found. An investigation concluded that he had likely taken his own life rather than face conviction. Michael Russo received a full police funeral, attended by hundreds of officers from the Chicago Police Department. His daughter Anna attended the service, now an orphan in more ways than one, having lost not only her father but also the truth about the choices he had made at the end of his life. Michael's final warning had been preserved in evidence lockers, a mysterious piece of a puzzle that no one would ever fully solve. The FBI had concluded that it represented Michael's attempt to warn Vincent about Salvatore, but the message had been too cryptic, too incomplete, and by the time Vincent had figured out what Michael meant, it was far too late. In the federal penitentiary where Vincent was incarcerated, he occupied a cell and passed the time reading books that he had always meant to read, writing letters that he would never send, and thinking about the night it all ended. The night when the rain fell on Chicago's old docks and a dying man whispered a name that would unravel an empire. Vincent Marino had learned far too late that empires built on fear eventually succumb to fear, that the hunter and the hunted are separated only by time, that the true measure of a man is not the enemies he defeats, but the friends he keeps or abandons, and that sometimes the most important warnings come from the people you have already lost.